There's a man on trial for murder. And the judge speaks to the accused. You are charged with beating your wife to death with a hammer. There's a voice heard in the back of the courtroom. Guy muttering under his breath, you jerk. The judge continues. You are charged with beating your pet cat with the same hammer. And again, the voice in the back of the courtroom, a little louder this time. You rotten jerk. Well, the judge looks at the area where the voice is coming from, kind of gives that stern look like, let's quiet it down. Judge continues. Finally, you are charged with beating your pet dog to death with that very same hammer. How do you plead? Before the man can answer, the fellow in the back of the courtroom stands up and he just starts pointing his finger at the accused. You evil, low down, dirty, nasty jerk of a jerk. Judge stops the proceedings, looks at the man in the back of the courtroom and says, now listen, I can understand that you're upset. This is a heinous crime that is on trial. But listen, you will not have this kind of an outburst in my courtroom. One more and you will be sentenced to contempt, and I'll put you in jail for a few days. Well, the man at the back of the courtroom stands up and he's very apologetic. And he says, Your Honor, I apologize, but you have got to understand one thing. I have been this man's neighbor for 15 years. And every time I would go over and try to borrow a hammer, he would say he didn't have one. The title of the message this morning is Life's Greatest Challenge. Now, originally, I had the title picked out, How Do You Love Your Enemy? But I was afraid that if I put that out, you would not show up for Sunday morning service. It's not what we want to hear. Love your enemy? Now, I can love thy neighbor, but love your enemy? Forgiveness? Have compassion on someone when they're calling you a jerk of a jerk? Well, we're not alone in this plight. How do we forgive our enemies? We can go back 2,000 years this morning. And in Matthew chapter 18, Peter, one of the apostles, asks Jesus this question. Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? And in verse 21, Jesus replies, no, 7 times 70. 7 times 70. That's 490 times. Doesn't that seem a bit unreasonable? I mean, how in the world can a Christian expect to forgive someone who deserves a good, swift kick? How do you forgive someone who has a bad attitude? Who earns a slap in the face? Jesus taught forgiveness. And he expands on this lesson in Romans chapter 12. So this morning, if you have your handout or your insert, let's begin. And the first thing that we're taught is that there's love with blessings. In verse 14, it reads, if people persecute you because you are a Christian, don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Now, 2,000 years ago, Paul was writing to Christians who were going through some really difficult times. Difficult times with neighbors, with friends. They were even having conflict in the church. It wasn't easy being a Christian then. The word persecute literally means to pursue. That's exactly what was happening when Paul was writing this. Enemies of the church, enemies of Christians, were pursuing them, going after them. People faced verbal abuse, physical abuse. Their faith was being tested. They were being ostracized in their community. They were being tormented because they were followers of Jesus Christ. It wasn't easy to follow the teachings of Jesus and to love your enemies. Hey, but that was then. What about today? Is it any easier? I think it's safe to say that we have all experienced that moment. That test. Someone in our life. Someone that has really pushed us. Or spoken evil against us. Has hurt us in some way. We know what it's like to be pursued. Paul instructs, don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. This is pure Christianity. I mean, but how do you get to that place where you can pray that God will bless your enemy? True story. This happened to me when I was ministering in Anderson, Indiana. The president of the men's club in our church asked me to make reservations at a local restaurant to have a business breakfast on a Saturday morning. And I said, certainly. I know where all the good restaurants are. And there was one, it was Perkins, and they had a really good breakfast. And not only did they have good food, but they had a room that you could reserve for special events. And so I called them a month in advance. I'd like to reserve that room. On the morning of our breakfast, more than a dozen men from the church arrived for the breakfast business meeting. And we were informed another group had our room. And that we could just sit in the main part of the restaurant. And we couldn't get together, and we were scattered all over the place, and so we had to cancel our meeting, and we ate breakfast, and we left. When I got to the cashier, I explained to her what happened, that I wasn't happy. And she kind of blew me off. It was kind of like, well, that's just the way it goes, She said, I can't help you. Wrong answer. I looked at her and I said, I want to talk to your manager. And so she did one of these to me. And so she had one of those, mics, and she called for the manager. And I waited for a minute or two, and she came out. This is an older woman, I would guess 40s or 50s. She came walking out toward me. I could tell by her face this was not going to be good. She had this look like, how dare you get me out of my office? And she came over, and I was as nice and pleasant as could be. And I explained to her the problem, that we had this room reserved, you gave it to someone else, and I really am upset about this. And she looked at me like, how dare you? And we began to engage in conversation. And you know how it gets ratcheted up? That's exactly where we were going. And I was getting hot under the collar. I thought, how dare you? I am a paying customer. And finally, I don't recall the exact words, I said, look it. This is the last time I'm ever going to set foot in this restaurant. And I'll never forget, she looked at me and she said, who cares? I said, I'm calling the owner tomorrow. I did. Monday morning, or it was Monday, 2 days. Called the owner. I explained to the owner exactly what happened, how I was just infuriated at this kind of service. And he apologized profusely. He gave me some tickets for free breakfast, put them in the mail. I think I ended up with 12 free breakfasts at the restaurant. And then he explained to me, my manager is having marital problems. And she has a teenage daughter. It's causing her a lot of grief. And she's been under a lot of pressure. And that taught me a lesson. I learned something from this. When people are hostile toward you, when they're persecuting you, pursuing you, it could be they've got a problem. And they're taking it out on you. You just happen to be there at the wrong time. People can be hurting. A lesson for us today. They can be emotionally or spiritually damaged. Having a bad day. We walk into their life at the wrong time. We're attacked. When someone is hostile toward you, consider the possibility that they're hurting. You're not the problem. They need prayer. They need blessings. 2,000 years ago, people were hostile toward Jesus, and he prayed for them. St. Paul, a Christian missionary, taught, don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Now I know that is hard to do. The temptation is maybe just to run away from it, ignore it. Many times the temptation is to fight back. And I confess, I was wrong. I fought back in that restaurant. I want to respond as Christ would respond. You never know how strong you are until you forgive someone who isn't sorry. And you accept an apology that was never offered. In explaining Romans 12:14, one preacher wrote that Paul was teaching us to disarm them. Disarm our enemy. Disarm them with our love rather than castigate them with our vengeance. So there's always a choice. We can disarm them or we can rip them apart. As Christians, we do our best to love our enemy. That brings us to the next verse, and I've titled this Love with Empathy. Verse 15, it reads, when others are happy, be happy with them. If they are sad, share their sorrow. Now, I guarantee you it's a whole lot easier being sad and sharing the sorrow for someone who is perceived as an enemy, someone you don't want to be around. I was watching the Iowa caucus this past Monday. Maybe you watched part of it. Hillary and Bernie, they're in a virtual tie now. Trump, Cruz, and Rubio, they all sound like they're winners. Huckabee said, I've had enough, I'm going back home. And I know that there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. I mean, that's all part of the process in electing a president. But I couldn't help feel sorry for one guy in the caucus. His name is Martin O'Malley. Now, some of you may wonder, who's Martin O'Malley? Martin O'Malley is running for president. He's a Democrat. He started his quest for the White House 6 years ago. I think that's all that's been on his mind. He really wanted to be president of the United States. He claimed that he was representing a new generation for our country. And so he worked hard, and he traveled around the country, and he made speeches, and he took part in every single debate, even though he trailed horribly in the polls. And then on Monday night, they tallied all the votes. Hillary got 49.8%. Bernie got 49.5%. O'Malley suspended his campaign. He's no longer running for president. He got about 0.5% of the vote. I think that equates to maybe 12 votes. And you know, I kind of felt sorry for him. Now, I probably would not vote for the man, but I felt sorry for him. He worked so hard, and now he's got to go back home to his state, and he's been whomped, you know? Now, it's easy, now here's where I'm going with this. It's easy to feel sorry for someone that you don't care for or you can't agree with. It's easy to feel sorry for someone who might even be an enemy at one time. It's harder to be happy with someone who is happy. One theologian observed that it requires more Christian grace to rejoice with the happy than to feel sad for those who are sorrowful. Not always easy, smiling when someone is the recipient of some good fortune. This is going to be tough, but I've got to do it. It's going to be therapeutic for me. On October 17th, 2015, punter Blake O'Neill fumbled a snap with 10 seconds left in a football game. Defensive back Jalen Watts-Jackson made the play of his life. He took the ball into the end zone. The clock ran out. Michigan State beat our Wolverines 27-23. I will never forget that moment. I sat in my man cave and I looked at the screen and I said, what just happened? What just happened? No, this cannot happen. Michigan was winning. They had the ball game. They were the winners. The next day, I was here in church. And Carrie Goldie was going to be an usher. I think she was wearing green and white. And I came out 15 minutes before the service, and I saw her in the back, and so I walked over to her, and as I'm getting closer, her grin is getting bigger and bigger. I can read her mind. I said, Carrie, congratulations. And I put my arm around her, gave her a hug, and I said, your team won. Boy, that was hard. It's hard to be happy when someone else is happy and you're not a part of that. Let's move on. That was good, though. Thank you for listening to me. Verse number 16, I want to talk about love with honesty. It reads, live in harmony with each other. Don't try to act important, but enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't think you know it all. Now that's good, but this is how the Peterson translation reads. Get along with each other. Don't be stuck up. Make friends with nobodies. Don't be the great somebody. When I read this verse, I think about how Jesus treated the disciples. Remember the passage when we are told that Jesus washed the disciples' feet? Let me read John chapter 13. It says, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He now showed the disciples the full extent of his love. It was time for supper. And the devil had already enticed Judas, Simon, son of Simon Iscariot, to carry out his plan to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that he had around him. Did you catch that? Jesus knew the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he, Jesus, had come from God. And then in the same breath, in the same passage, it reminds us that the devil had already enticed Judas. Jesus had every reason, being God, the Son of God, to look down on the disciples, mere mortals. I mean, he's the Son of God. And yet he stooped down and he washed their feet. And not only did he wash the feet of the 11 who loved him and was faithful in following him, he washed the feet of Judas, the traitor. And then in verse 16, he said, I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done. Wow. Now this is a hard lesson. I mean, you love your enemies, you love your opponents, you love the people who are on the other side of the fence by just being yourself, being honest, and Scripture says, don't be a phony. St. Paul wrote, live in harmony with each other. Don't try to act important, but enjoy the company of the ordinary people. And then he adds, and don't think you know it all. Now, he's not suggesting that we have to agree with others in all things. We've got some wiggle room here. We can agree to disagree. That's okay. We can keep our mouth shut when an argument is not going the way we would like it because we want to keep harmony in the church. Jesus is teaching us, whatever we do, resist pride. Because let's face it, when you're in a heated argument, pride kind of wells up, doesn't it? I'm going to get the last word. I know what's right. And Jesus is teaching, no, don't think so highly of yourself. Be a person with a humble heart. Which now brings us to the last verse I want us to read. With results, the last 4 verses, they are the end results of doing your best to love your enemy. Verse 17 says, never pay back evil for evil. It's the grace of God that will help us resist that kind of a temptation. It says, do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. God's going to help us. Help us live a life that is above reproach in all of our dealings. But I remember my mother. She pounded this into me. I can still hear her voice. When I was young, she would say, now, Billy, when you grow up, I'm going to be proud of you no matter what you do, whether you're a garbage collector or you're the President of the United States. I'm going to be so proud of you, but don't you ever lie, and don't you ever cheat. She was right. The saving, sanctifying grace of God gives us the power to do things in such a way that everyone can see that we are honorable. Verse 18, do your part to live in peace with everyone. And I believe that Paul was a realist. Come on, his head was not in the clouds. You can't always live in peace and harmony with enemies. I know that. And God is, and I want to make it clear, God is not calling us to be a doormat. Doesn't mean that we have to just lay down and let people wipe their feet on us. There's a time and a place when you defend what is right and good. It's not always possible to live in peace with everyone. But with God's help, we can try. Verse 19, it tells us not to worry about avenging our hurt. It says, leave that to God. Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of England, died in 1969. And rumor has it that he had a parrot by the name of Charlie. Now this is urban legend. I don't know if it's true or not. I like to think it is. And this parrot is still alive. It's now 117 years old. It's in some kind of a bird sanctuary. During World War II, Charlie the parrot kept the Prime Minister company. And the bird was famous for occasionally squawking out 4-letter obscenities about the Nazis. Urban legend says that Charlie, at the age of 117, is still squawking out those same obscenities. You know what I think? I think some people are like old parrots. They never forget. They can't let it go. The war is over. We won. The Nazis have been defeated. And so leave it with God. Verse 20 teaches us that we should show kindness to those who don't deserve our kindness. And then verse 21 sums it up. Don't let evil get the best of you, but conquer evil by doing